Hi, welcome to my channel where I discuss everything I love about my favorite books. As a favorite, Malazan has been sitting at the top of the list ever since I started the series back in late 2020. I discovered the Malazan corner of BookTube, I think a little bit when I was about halfway through Dead House Gates, and I've been following a lot of the conversation there and really enjoying all the discussions in the community. And being now 7 books into the series, I have been loving it enough and enjoying the community enough that I have wanted to jump in with my own discussions on the series. This is my first video, and I do intend to talk about everything non-Malazan as well that I have loved recently and earlier than that as well. But today's discussion will be about how I think that the Malazan Book of the Fallen really scales up human experience. Now, I've heard the series, the Malazan World, and the series in particular as well. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is what I mean when I say this series. I haven't read any of the books by Ian Esselmont yet. I do plan to get to them when I finish the Book of the Fallen series. So I've heard these series described as being epic in scale and epic in scope, and I definitely agree. There are several sapient species. There are about 50 to 100 characters listed in the dramatis personae section of every book. There are enough gods in the world to give the Hindu pantheon a run for its money, and there are characters with lifespans of hundreds of thousands of years. And I think that's the part that really stands out to me as the incredible scale of the world. Believable characters who have lifespans of hundreds of thousands of years. I think I've read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi series where characters have lifespans of a few centuries, and it's really hard to pull them off as believable characters. For the most part, they end up reading like normal lifespan humans or people or races. So for Erikson to pull off making characters that are hundreds of thousands of years old seem realistic and believable, I think that's a feat of writing. So there are 4 examples that I'd like to discuss today, which I think really stood out to me as being fantastic examples of this. And then I'm gonna try and dissect a little bit about, I think, what works about these and why they stood out to me so much. So to start with the examples, the examples that I plan to pull are from Dead House Gates and Memories of Ice. So it'll be spoilers for those 2 books. No spoilers for anything coming after those. So the first example is from Dead House Gates. One of the main threads we follow in that book is the journey of Icarium and Mapo as they are headed somewhere, unclear where. 7 books in, I think I still don't quite know where they were headed before they ran into Fiddler and all the others. So anyway, in the course of their journey, they come upon this town which has been all but destroyed, and there is one device or machine that is still standing that Icarium notices. He sees on the inscription that this was gifted to the city by Icarium 94,000 years ago. So I think this is the first instance overall where we meet a character who has a lifespan that long, and in this, as the reader, we find out with Icarium that he's that old, and we share all of his thoughts as we go over his realization, right? Like he goes over, oh, did I make a mistake in my calculation? No, this can't be right. I can't be that old and not have any memory of it. And we eventually, he concludes, I think, at the end of that scene that, it must be a mistake. But we know from Mappo's musings alongside of Icarium's that, he's not mistaken. He is, in fact, nearly 100,000 years old. And so that discussion and that realization that he's that old and the implications of that, I think we get to grapple with Icarium, with what it means to be that long-lived, to not have any memory of it. And I think that conversation is just done really well, in my opinion, between Icarium and Mappo. The second example I have is from the prologue of Memories of Ice. We see I think this is pretty much the first section in the prologue after the epitaph and epigraph, sorry. And we see that the date is nearly 300,000 years ago, and we find out that that's when the Telan ritual was conducted by the Telanamas to become these undead warriors who have since been pursuing this campaign of vengeance against the Jagut. Until this book, in the first two books, if I'm remembering correctly, all we know about the Telanamas is that they became these undead warriors with the explicit purpose of killing every last Jagut. That's their sole intention. And we've met just one of them, and we don't know much else besides. And then we find out in the prologue of Memories of Ice that this ritual was conducted 300,000 years ago, which is a very long time to be so angry about something that single-mindedly you're continuing to pursue that purpose. And yeah, so that, I think, as a revelation, that really stood out to me as something that made me think about a lot of things. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But yeah, I think to go from just, if I had to guess before Memories of Ice how long ago the Telanamas conducted their ritual, I would maybe have guessed a few centuries at most. That is a long enough time. That was the longest time I could conceive of where this sort of vengeance campaign made sense. And yet we find out that this happened 300,000 years ago. So a lot of things in Memories of Ice then just hit that much harder, because we find that the Telanamas have since come to, if not regret, at least wonder just how long this is going to take, right? There is always a new tyrant for them to destroy. I think in the first two books, we see their purpose as need to kill every last Jagut, but in the third book, we find out it's a little bit more nuanced than that. They want to destroy every tyrant, and they have found, unfortunately, that tyrants are not restricted to just the Jagut. There are other kinds of tyrants that keep cropping up all the time, and they have to think about whether their purpose still makes sense. And even if it does not, even if they come to the conclusion that they can't do this anymore, there's not much they can do. They are at the mercy of a TBD bonecaster who is yet to come and relieve them of their burdens. So I think just the enormity of their, I think the intensity of just how motivated they had to have been to conduct this ritual and say no matter what the cost, and then keep at it for 300,000 years. I think, that really stood out to me as well. And then later we find out, as Itkovian takes on their burden of grief and regret, that some of them hadn't been really on board with the ritual, or they have regrets that came maybe soon after about how they wish they had started a family instead, or how they wish they had married the person that they had loved at the time the ritual was conducted, and they don't get to live out any of that now, and they've had to carry that regret for 300,000 years. That is a very, very long time to carry around that sort of burden, and it seems believable. I buy just how burdened they are with just those few snippets that we get of each Tyrannomas's memories and thoughts as Itkovian sort of sucks them up and relieves them of their burden. I mean, and speaking of Itkovian, all of that regret and pain, it feels like too much to contemplate for even just one Tyrannomas to carry, one Tyrannomas to carry the burden of for quite this long. And Itkovian just unflinchingly takes the burden from them, from every single Tyrannomas present at that place. And between them, they have probably, a few million years worth of collective regret and grief. And Itkovian just takes it on. He starts to flag a little way through, but he keeps on and does not stop until he has taken away the burden of every single Tyrannomas present. So that makes us contemplate the enormity of the sacrifice, the magnitude of resilience that man must have to keep going, even though it was crushing him with the weight of all of that pain. So, so all of that makes us think about, the magnitude of that sacrifice. And then we go back and think about a scene, I think, a few pages before this scene where Itkovian takes on the Tyrannomas burden, and he, I think, attempts to reach out towards Korlat and tries to relieve her of her pain, and then he flinches away. He says, "No, I can't handle that." So this man, who unflinchingly took on the burden of an entire clan of Tyrannomas, had to stop himself from a single Testandi's pain, had to protect himself from that because he knew he couldn't handle it. So that makes us think about, just comparatively, a Testandi has at least as much burden as an entire clan of Tyrannomas. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is, these hundreds of thousands of years old characters just seem so realistic. If we think about it really, if you live that long, you've probably accumulated a lot of pain, regret, grief. You've probably lost a few loved ones and you've had to live with it for a very long time. Whatever else is going on. With the scene between Itkovian and Korlat, where he tries to take away her burden and decides not to, I think in any other book or story, I would probably assume that this is foreshadowing of, revelations to come about some deep, dark past that Korlat has. But in this case, it's simply a statement about just how long she's been alive, just how much she probably has needed to live with for all this time. And that's done in a very believable way. So I think, going off on a little bit of a tangent, I think I said earlier that this is a discussion about the scale of human experience. So we have a world in which, the lifespan has been scaled up to 100,000 years, and the experience of these characters has to proportionately scale, has to be expanded in a way that still makes sense to us. At first glance, 100,000-year-old man might seem almost ridiculous, but to read them as believable characters with whom we can empathize and say, yeah, I know, I understand your pain, I can see what you might possibly be going through at this moment. I think that has to have some really base structural foundations in the story and narrative overall to be working so well. I am a software engineer by profession, and we deal with problems of scaling up a system all the time. We have to keep redesigning systems all the time because we didn't think about how something would scale with respect to another. There are examples from biology about how if you scale up a human to 10 times their size in all dimensions, the skeleton would probably not be able to handle your weight, because by scaling a human up 10 times, you're scaling their weight up by 1,000 times, but the skeleton can only carry 100 times the weight that it currently does. So it might collapse. So giants can't exist. So what that means is you have to structurally change the skeleton or the foundation of your system, of your structure, to be able to have the system still make sense, to still work the way you intend. And this might seem like a really strange application of that example, but I think that is what Erikson did here with fundamentally setting up the storytelling and narrative structure of the series to be able to write such believable, long-lived characters whose miseries and burdens and little joys also that you can commiserate with, to understand and empathize with. And I think that so I try to dissect what about the narrative structure works so well to tell this story. For instance, if in Icarium's character introduction we had just heard, oh, by the way, he's 100,000 years old, would that have had the same impact as that 3-page long conversation in which we find out that that's his age at least? I don't think so, but I'm not a writer, so I don't know if there's a way to make that work in that manner. But what I do know is Erikson's way works magnificently. So let me try and go over what I think probably works for this narrative structure, to have these examples that so stood out to me and really spoke to me as a large-scale example of human experience work so well. So we start with the first introduction we get to Icarium is in a conversation between Anomandarik and Baruch in Gardens of the Moon, where it is mentioned that Icarium gifted the city, I believe, I forget what it's called, but it's a timekeeping device that Icarium gifted to the city 1,000 years ago. At the time I read it, I figured that this was just someone who had been alive 1,000 years ago and gifted the city these devices at the time. Beginning of Dead House Gates, we meet this character. So we know that he's been alive for at least 1,000 years old. And eventually we have Mapo musing about everything Icarium's done, about everything that he has destroyed, and yet he has so much empathy for him because he doesn't do it. He's not under control when he does. And then eventually, towards the end of the book, over a 3-page long conversation, it is revealed to Icarium as well as the reader that that he is that old. He is 100,000 years old. And then so now we've met 100,000-year-old character. It doesn't seem quite so unrealistic to us anymore. We have had a chance, if not to think about it later, at least enough time just over the course of that conversation to realize that, this lifespan makes sense. This sort of life experience for this character makes sense. He does not remember it, but that's fine. He's grappling with it just as much as the reader is at the moment. Maybe by the end of the book, we've come to terms with, characters can live that long, and this is the sort of life experience they can have. And so we get to build on top of that in Memories of Ice, where just casually thrown a number in the prologue tells us that this ritual was conducted 300,000 years ago. And there we get to contemplate the implications of that, the wonder about a lot of things. It's like taking all of these human experiences, putting it under a microscope and blowing them up in proportion so that you notice things that you may not have noticed otherwise. You might ask questions that you probably wouldn't think about otherwise. For myself, I had a lot of questions about the implications of the fact that the Tilanimas conducted their ritual so long ago, and they're still actively pursuing their campaign. They're actively still keeping up with their purpose from all that time ago. I had to wonder if it's a statement about the all-consuming nature of vengeance, or is it a statement about, when you believe in a cause, you have to fight for it no matter what? Or is it a statement about the cost of that and to make you wonder just whether it is still worth it? Or is it a statement about how something that you do now, maybe somewhat thoughtlessly, can have repercussions 300 millennia later? These are all questions that I do not have answers to. Maybe it's a statement about all of them. Maybe it's a statement about none of them. But for myself, I know that I thought about these things. Maybe I would not have thought about them outside of having read these books. But yeah, so because it was, if it had been, I've read a few revenge stories that span 20 years long. They did not make me ask similar questions. I think just the fact that it lasted quite so long begs some questions that we have to think about. And I think that's what makes these books so magnificent and why I love them so much. So anyway, coming back to why I think these work. So we layered or built on top of the revelation that Icarium is 100,000 years old, with now, we believe in you to think about 300,000-year-old characters. That's cool. And we get a little bit more of the picture as we go through Memories of Ice, where some of the Tilanimas have conversations with other characters about how, it started to not make sense to them anymore. And how there's always another tyrant that they have to fight. They don't know if it's going to ever end. Anyway, eventually we get to the point where Itkovian relieves them of their burden. And so we've spent enough time over the course of this book contemplating just how burdensome life and existence must be to the Tilanimas. And so now we get to think about the magnitude of Itkovian's sacrifice and just how selfless a man he must be to take that on. And from there, we get to build on top of that realization to think about just what else a Tistandi must be going through to have a man like Itkovian flinch away from not wanting to take on their burden, that it's too big of a sacrifice for even him to make. So I think that those were all, so I think that what my interpretation of why this works is that we get these bits and pieces of information that are, in the core, in the foundation of the story, so that eventually when Erikson builds these structures on top of them, has these characters tell us about their life stories, about what their experience is like as a 300 millennia old character, we can understand, we can follow along with them and empathize with them. So I think it's in the fact that each part of the story is building on top of the other for the implication to mean more and more, for the revelations about this, about their lifespans, about their experiences, about their burdens to mean more and more with each layering of the story. But also it's just in smaller things that he does, like the example of Icarium just being mentioned in Gardens of the Moon, where he just as maybe having lived 1,000 years ago, and then building on top of that with at least 1,000-year-old character. That's what we realize in Deadhouse Gates at the beginning, and then so it starts small and then builds up and up, and each example also builds on top of each other. So I think that's what works. I think Erikson did something fundamental with the structure of narrative and storytelling to make this such a believable and well-realized world with again realistic 300,000-year-old characters. So those are my thoughts. Some of it got a bit rambly. I apologize for that. But let me know what you think in the comments. I will see you in the next one, which will most likely not be a Malazan video. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.